The adult horror of the vanishing room. Jonathan Mercer arrived at the Blackwood Grand Hotel just past midnight, weary from his journey and eager for rest. The hotel, a grand yet fading relic of a bygone era, loomed before him with its darkened windows and grotesque gargoyle carvings that seemed to leer at him as he approached. The gas lamps along the street flickered against the damp London air, casting wavering shadows along the cobblestones. At the front desk, the clerk, an elderly man with sunken eyes and an unsettlingly still expression, welcomed him with a nod. "A room for one, Mr. Mercer?" "Yes, I booked room 306, Jonathan replied, setting down his briefcase. The clerk's eyes twitched ever so slightly at the mention of the number. "Room 306, he repeated, his fingers hesitating over the heavy brass register book. "Ah, yes, of course." Jonathan did not fail to notice the odd pause before the man slid an antique brass key across the desk. He took it, his fingers brushing the cold metal, and turned toward the grand staircase that wound its way upward into shadow. The hotel had an eerie stillness, a suffocating quiet broken only by the distant ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the depths of the building. The hallway on the third floor was dimly lit, the sconces along the wall flickering as though disturbed by an unseen breath. As Jonathan turned the key in the lock of room 306, the door groaned open, revealing a chamber suffused with an inexplicable chill. The decor was antiquated. Heavy velvet drapes hung stiffly over the window. A four-poster bed stood at the center, its dark mahogany frame exuding an air of quiet menace. A writing desk sat against the far wall, its surface marred with deep scratches. Yet the strangest feature was the absence of a mirror. Where one should have been, above the ornate dresser, there was only an empty frame. Exhaustion overtook Jonathan's unease, and he undressed before slipping beneath the thick blankets. Sleep came swiftly but was not kind. Shadows swam behind his eyelids, and a low murmuring sound pressed against his mind, like whispers from a great distance, calling his name. When he awoke, it was not in his bed. He was standing in a narrow alleyway, the scent of damp stone and iron heavy in the air. A cold wind bit at his exposed skin. Looking down, his breath caught in his throat. His hands were slick with blood. Crimson stained his white cuffs, dripped from his fingertips onto the frozen cobblestones. Panic surged through him, but no memory surfaced. His heart pounded as he stumbled forward, searching for a sign, a reason, anything to explain his presence here. A deep voice, guttural and thick with something inhuman, whispered behind him, "You have returned." Jonathan spun, but there was no one there. Only the dark, gaping mouth of the alley stretching deeper into the night. Fleeing back to the hotel, his mind reeled. The front doors yawned open at his approach, and he burst inside, breathless and wild-eyed. The lobby was as silent as before, the desk clerk standing precisely where he had left him, watching with unreadable eyes. "Did you enjoy your evening, Mr. Mercer?" the old man intoned softly, as though he had expected this. Jonathan could not answer. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists, hiding the evidence of whatever horror had unfolded while he had slept. He climbed the stairs in frantic haste, reaching his room and slamming the door shut behind him. The bed was made. The air was undisturbed. But on the writing desk, something new had appeared. A journal, a leather-bound tome he did not recognize. Yet upon opening, he found page after page scrawled in his own handwriting. The last entry, dated that very night, read only, "The room does not exist, but I do." Jonathan recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. The clock on the nightstand read 3:06 a.m. He tried to calm himself, to think rationally, but the truth clawed at his mind. If he had written these words, He had no memory of doing so. And as he turned toward the empty mirror frame above the dresser, he saw it for the first time. Not his reflection, but the shape of another man standing just behind him, smiling. The Puppet's Curse. The town of Colchester had always been a place where the past clung to the present like ivy to stone. The shadows of ancient buildings stretched across the cobbled streets, and whispers of forgotten secrets echoed through the narrow alleys, making it a place where few dared to walk after dusk. It was a town untouched by time, a place where everything remained as it had been for centuries, preserved in stillness, locked away from the world. It was within this town, beneath the gloom of towering oaks and the eerie silence of deserted streets, that Elias Thornwood, a man of peculiar talents, arrived. Known to few and acknowledged by even fewer, Elias had inherited a legacy, one that he neither understood nor welcomed. He was a ventriloquist, a performer whose art had once captivated the largest of crowds, but now, at the twilight of his career, had become a shadow of its former self. His fame had faded, the theaters no longer filled with applause, and his once pristine reputation had dulled with the passage of time. He had not planned on returning to Colchester. His life had taken him far from its ancient streets. But when the letter arrived, a letter sealed with wax, bearing the crest of a long-forgotten lineage, it had found him at the bottom of his deepest despair. It was a summons, one that he could not ignore. The letter spoke of an inheritance, one that would return him to the place of his birth, to the house of his ancestors. Elias had never known his family well. He had been raised in the orphanage after the death of his parents, and the memories of them were vague, like mist on a cold morning. But the letter spoke of a possession, an item of great importance that had been passed down through generations, and it was now his, for reasons he could not understand. Upon arriving at the Thornwood estate, a decaying mansion shrouded in mist, Elias found himself standing before a room filled with forgotten relics. Dust-laden bookshelves, faded portraits, and moth-eaten tapestries lined the walls, their once vibrant colors now dulled by time. In the center of the room, covered in a white sheet, sat an object that immediately drew Elias's gaze. It was a puppet, an unsettlingly lifelike creation. The craftsmanship was exquisite, yet its eyes seemed to glimmer with a strange, unnatural gleam. Its painted face held a mocking grin, and the clothes it wore, though fine, were old and frayed at the edges. As Elias approached, a sense of unease settled over him. There was something about the puppet that made his skin crawl. "That is yours now," came a voice from behind him. Elias turned to see an old man standing in the doorway. His face was lined with age, his eyes clouded with years of sorrow and secrets. "Your family's legacy," the man continued, his voice thick with regret. "You must take care of it. It holds more than you think." Elias said nothing, his eyes locked on the puppet. There was something in its gaze that seemed to reach into him, something that felt alive. The old man watched him for a moment longer, as if weighing whether to say more. But then he turned and left the room, the door creaking as it shut behind him. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he reached out to touch the puppet. The instant his fingers brushed its cold wooden face, a strange energy surged through him, as though the puppet had taken hold of his very soul. A chill swept through the room and the air grew thick, as though it were charged with something dark and malevolent. He pulled his hand back in haste, a shiver running down his spine. The puppet's eyes seemed to follow him, its grin widening, as if it were alive, aware of him. Elias knew then that this was no ordinary puppet. This was a relic of some darker time, a thing that held a power he could not begin to comprehend. For a moment, he stood frozen, his thoughts clouded by a deep sense of dread. The man on Highway 55. Some roads are just roads, but others, Others have stories, warnings, and things lurking in the shadows. What if you saw the same person more than once, miles apart, on an empty highway? Would you stop? Or would you keep driving and pray they don't follow? This is the chilling story of a trucker who learned that some highways should never be traveled alone. Every trucker has a road they try to avoid. For me, that road is Highway 55. It's an old stretch of asphalt winding through endless miles of wilderness, barely lit, with small, forgotten towns scattered along the way. I try to steer clear of it whenever possible, but one night I had no choice but to take it. And I'll never forget what happened. I was hauling canned goods from Portland to a distribution center in northern Idaho. My GPS said Highway 55 was the fastest route. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I was on a tight schedule, so I took it. At first, everything was fine. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet. The towering pines on either side of me swayed gently in the breeze. It almost felt peaceful. Then, around 10 p.m., I saw the first sign of trouble. A car was pulled over on the shoulder, its hood up, hazard lights blinking. As I got closer, my high beams lit up the scene. The car was old, rusted, dented, and covered in dirt. But what really caught my attention was the man standing next to it. He was tall and thin, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat that looked way too heavy for the warm night. He didn't wave me down. He didn't signal for help. He just stood there, completely still, staring at my truck as I passed. A chill ran down my spine. Something about him wasn't right. I kept driving, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe he was just a stranded driver, I told myself. But why didn't he ask for help? Why did he just stand there? 15 minutes later, I saw another car. This one was pulled over at a weird angle on a narrow pull-off, its headlights off and the driver's door wide open. I slowed down, leaning forward to get a better look. And that's when I saw him. The same man. Standing just a few feet from the car, his silhouette barely visible in my headlights. This time, he took a step toward the road. His head tilted slightly, as if trying to get a better look at me. I hit the gas. The road ahead twisted and turned through the dense forest. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, and every rustling sound felt like something creeping closer. Then I saw the truck. It was parked on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing. Relief flooded me. Another trucker. Maybe I wasn't alone out here after all. I pulled up alongside the cab and honked my horn. No response. I looked inside. The cab was empty. The engine was running, the lights were on, but there was no driver. No footprints in the dirt, no sign of anyone at all. Before I could process what I was seeing, my CB radio crackled to life. A voice, low, distorted, spoke through the static. "You shouldn't have stopped." I froze. My grip on the wheel tightened. "Who is this?" I demanded. The radio hissed with static. Then the voice came again. "He's watching." I slammed the radio off and floored the gas, my truck roaring as I sped down the highway. Then my engine sputtered. No, no, no. The dashboard lights flickered, and suddenly my truck lost power. I coasted to a stop in the middle of the highway, heart pounding. Silence. The only sound was the wind whispering through the trees. I reached for my phone. No signal. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab. My breath fogged in the cool night air as I swung the beam around. And then I saw him, standing in the middle of the road about 50 feet away. His hat hid most of his face, but I could feel his eyes locked on me, cold and unblinking. He took a slow step forward, and then another. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "I have a weapon." He didn't stop. I scrambled back into my cab, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life. I threw the truck into gear, slamming the accelerator. As I sped toward him, He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. At the last second, I swerved, barely missing him. My tires screeched as I corrected the truck, and when I dared to glance in the rearview mirror, he was still standing in the middle of the road, just watching me. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station hours later. The attendant must have seen how shaken I was because he asked if something had happened. I hesitated, then told him everything. He gave me a strange look. "You were on 55, weren't you?" "How did you know?" I asked. He leaned in slightly. "Lots of stories about that road," he said, voice low. "You're not the first to see him, but you might be the first to make it out. I've avoided Highway 55 ever since. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that man. His stillness, his unblinking stare. And I wonder, what would have happened if my truck hadn't stared? This abandoned rest stop has a dark secret. Every trucker knows to avoid abandoned rest stops. They're quiet, too quiet. No cars, no people. Just a feeling that you're not alone. One night I had no choice but to stop at one. I thought I was alone, until I realized something was watching me. And the worst part? It wasn't human. I was hauling a load through the back roads of Arizona, running on fumes and running out of options. My GPS showed the next truck stop was still 50 miles away, and I was too exhausted to keep driving. Then, through the darkness, I saw it, an old rest stop. It looked abandoned. No cars, no lights except for a single flickering street lamp near the vending machines. The building itself was boarded up, but the parking lot was empty and open. It was better than falling asleep behind the wheel. I pulled in and parked under the streetlight, leaving my engine running. The air felt too still. There were no crickets, no wind, just silence. A cold unease crept over me, but I shook it off. Just a quick rest, I told myself. Then back on the road. I leaned back in my seat, closed my eyes, and tried to relax. But then, bang! A loud metallic slam echoed through the lot. My eyes snapped open. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight. Something had just hit my trailer. I stepped out, shining my light around. No one was there. I checked the back of my truck. The locks were secure. No sign of anything. Just deep scratches in the pavement, leading from the woods to my trailer. A chill ran down my spine. Then, out of the corner of my eye, movement. I swung my flashlight toward the abandoned rest stop building. A shadow darted past the broken windows. I wasn't alone. I rushed back to my cab, locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I was about to leave when my headlights lit up the glass doors of the building. There was someone standing inside, or rather, something. It was tall, too tall. Its arms hung unnaturally long, its skin stretched thin over sharp bones. And its face, it had no eyes, just a wide, jagged grin. Then it moved, not walked, moved. A blur of motion rushing toward my truck. I floored it. Tires screeched against the pavement as I sped out of the lot. My mirrors shook as I hit 80 miles per hour, but I didn't dare look back. Then, my radio crackled. A voice, barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have stopped." I yanked the plug, my breath ragged. 20 miles later, I pulled into a packed truck stop, parking under the brightest lights I could find. I told a few truckers what happened. One of them went pale. "You stopped at Devil's Hollow, didn't you?" he asked. "What the hell is Devil's Hollow?" I demanded. He hesitated. "That place was shut down 30 years ago after a driver went missing. They found his truck, but not him. Some say he's still there. Others say something else took his place." I never stopped at an abandoned rest stop again. Because sometimes places are abandoned for a reason, and sometimes they're not empty. The haunting cargo truckers haul all kinds of things: furniture, food, machinery. But what if you were given a trailer with no explanation? No paperwork, no details, just a simple rule: don't open it. Would you take the job? This is the story of one trucker who did and discovered he was transporting something far worse than cargo. It was a rainy October night when I got a last-minute job offer. The dispatcher sounded almost desperate, offering double the pay if I could haul a trailer from a small town in Montana to Spokane, Washington. Money was tight. I didn't ask questions. I just took the job. I arrived at the pickup location just before midnight, a rundown warehouse at the edge of town. The place looked abandoned, its windows dark, the pavement slick from the rain. A single man stood by the trailer, his face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat and a long raincoat. "You the driver?" he asked in a low, rough voice. "Yeah, Big Sky Hauling. You got paperwork?" He handed me a thin folder. Inside was nothing but a delivery address and a signature. No details about the cargo, no weight specifications. Then he said something that made me uneasy. "You don't open it. Just get it there by sunrise." I hesitated. "What exactly am I hauling?" The man just stared at me. "Doesn't matter. Just don't stop." I wanted to ask more, but something about him made me drop it. I hooked up the trailer, did a quick light check, and pulled out of the lot. The rain picked up as I hit the highway, drumming against my windshield. The road was empty, dark, and endless. I turned on the radio, trying to shake off the strange feeling settling in my chest. Then, the first odd thing happened. My GPS started glitching. The screen flickered, the route vanishing and reappearing. The estimated arrival time kept resetting. I chalked it up to the storm and kept driving, watching the road signs instead. Then, I heard it. A faint, thumping sound. At first, it was subtle, easy to dismiss as the trailer shifting. But as the miles ticked by, it grew louder, rhythmic, steady, like something inside was moving. I checked my mirrors. The trailer looked secure. The locks were still in place, but the sound wouldn't stop. It almost sounded like knocking. I clenched the wheel, my pulse quickening. Just the road, just the wind, I told myself. Then, the radio turned on by itself. Static poured through the speakers. I hadn't touched the dial. The power knob was off. Beneath the static, whispers crackled through. Low, overlapping voices, too many to make out. My stomach dropped. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The static grew louder, the whispers more frantic. Then, through the noise, a single word cut through. "Stop!" I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded slightly before coming to a stop in the middle of the empty highway. Silence. The thumping in the trailer stopped. The static cut out. For a moment, everything was still. Then, I felt it. A weight, cold and heavy, pressed against the back of my cab, like a hand resting on the roof. My breath hitched. My hands trembled on the wheel. I stared at the rearview mirror, dreading what I might see. But there was nothing. I didn't wait to find out more. I floored the gas. The radio went silent. The thumping faded. I didn't stop again until I reached Spokane. When I arrived at the drop-off location, a nondescript warehouse, much like the one I'd picked up from, a man in a suit was waiting. He didn't check the cargo. He didn't even open the trailer. He just handed me an envelope. "You're done," he said. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to. I just took the money and left. But when I got back to my dispatcher, I asked about the job. He looked at me, confused. "What job?" he asked. "The one you sent me on last night, the private haul to Spokane." His face went pale. "We never assigned you a haul last night." I checked my truck's logs. They were corrupted. No pickup location, no route, no recorded stops, as if the trip had never happened. To this day, I don't know what I was really hauling that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone on the road, I hear faint whispers through my radio. I feel the weight shift in my empty trailer, and I wonder. The Hollow Bride. The clock struck midnight. The chill of the evening air crept through the open window of the bridal chamber, brushing against the heavy drapes that were drawn but not quite heavy enough to shut out the ominous stillness of the night. It was a stillness that would have made any sensible soul uneasy, yet none could disturb the jubilant celebration that had taken place only hours before. The wedding had been the event of the year in this forsaken village, a union between two souls bound by tradition, and for the onlookers, it had been nothing short of a fairy tale. But to Nathaniel Wren, the newlywed groom, it was an evening that would linger in his memory, not as a moment of joy, but as one of unspeakable terror. His bride, Eleanor, lay beside him on the grand four-poster bed, the sheets tangled around their bodies as they lay in the silent, cold embrace of the midnight hour. The soft flicker of the candlelight illuminated her features, which had once been the subject of so many longing gazes. But tonight, something about her seemed off. A hollow vacancy lurked in her eyes, a chilling stillness that sent an icy shiver down Nathaniel's spine whenever he dared to look at her. She had been so radiant during the ceremony, with her delicate veil covering her face like a sliver of moonlight. She had walked down the aisle, her pale hands clutching her bouquet, and her every movement had been graceful, her smile enchanting. Nathaniel had been so entranced by her beauty, so convinced that he had found his perfect match. But now, in the quiet of the bridal chamber, the magic of that night seemed to unravel, thread by thread, like an old tapestry succumbing to rot. He shifted uneasily in the bed, his heart racing as he glanced at his bride. The silence stretched between them, and the distance felt as wide as the ocean. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, but her eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead into the darkness that seemed to engulf the room. Nathaniel swallowed, his throat dry. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Are you well? You don't look well." Her lips parted slightly as though she intended to speak, but instead, a thin, raspy breath escaped her throat. She reached for his hand, her fingers cold and clammy as they wrapped around his wrist. I am not what I appear to be, Nathaniel," she said, her voice low, and for the first time that night, her tone carried a note of something unsettling, something ancient, as though she were not speaking as the young woman he had wed hours ago. A chill ran through him, the warmth of the wedding day seemingly drained from his body. He attempted to pull his hand from hers, but her grip tightened. He could feel the flesh of her fingers, cold, wet, and unnatural, like the touch of a corpse freshly unearthed. "What's happening?" Nathaniel's voice was barely a whisper, but his fear was palpable. "Eleanor, what is this?" Her eyes finally moved, focusing on him with an intensity that felt too unnatural to be a mere gaze of affection. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice now a mere hiss, "I have been waiting for you, for many years. You see, I died long before our wedding day." Nathaniel's heart seemed to stop, the words hanging in the air like a death knell. His eyes widened in disbelief, his mouth dry as dust. What do you mean? You're not dead? You're here, with me," he stammered, his voice rising in panic. Her lips twitched into something resembling a smile, though it was more akin to a grimace of decay. "No, Nathaniel, I died long ago. It was not the flesh that binds us, but the soul. And you were the one who was to take my place." His breath caught in his throat. His thoughts raced to the old legends, the whispered rumors of dark things that slumbered beneath the surface of the village. Old stories his mother had told him in hushed tones when he was a child, tales of brides who never truly died, but were bound to walk in the realm of the living by the will of a dark and terrible force. The room felt colder still, as though the very air had been drained of life. "You're not Eleanor." Nathaniel's voice trembled as the horrible truth began to take shape in his mind. "No," she answered, her voice now flat, hollow, as though the words themselves had been plucked from a grave. "I am the hollow bride. Eleanor's soul is long gone. She was never meant to be my vessel. But you, Nathaniel, you were the one chosen. You were to complete the bond." She drew in a sharp breath, her chest heaving as if the very act of speaking was tearing her apart. Nathaniel felt her grip on his wrist tighten even more, sending waves of icy pain through his bones. And in the dim light of the room, he saw something that chilled him to the marrow. Her skin, pale and delicate, began to wither, her once beautiful features beginning to rot before his very eyes. He tried to pull away, but it was as though his body no longer obeyed him. His